Our first question in the Chapter 6 discussion questions is to describe 3 reasons, genetic reasons, why small populations are vulnerable to extinction. There are 6 possible answers that I can find in the book, but I'll detail just 3 here. The first is inbreeding depression. In small populations, genetic drift leads to an increase in homozygosity and a decrease in heterozygosity, and that will inevitably lead to an increase in the frequency of deleterious conditions. Ordinarily, natural selection means deleterious conditions are rare in a population, but because genetic drift makes them more common in small populations, they're more likely to have an impact on the fitness of the population. A second related reason is that small populations that are more homozygous are more vulnerable to parasites and pathogens. Sexually reproducing populations are in a constant coevolutionary arms race between parasites and pathogens. Increased homozygosity in small populations means that offspring are more likely to phenotypically resemble their parents. This also applies to the state of their immune system, which means that pathogens that may have affected their parents will also affect them, which disables the benefits of sexual reproduction. And a third factor is the loss of variation that means that population loses the ability to adapt to changing conditions. The larger the population size, the more likely a new mutation is to survive, and therefore the larger the population, the more genetic variation we have. Small populations thus lack the ability to genetically respond to changing environmental conditions. Question 2 asks us to detail 3 non-genetic reasons why small populations are vulnerable to extinction. Again, there are many possible answers, and I'll detail just 3 here. The first is demographic stochasticity. With the blue line, I've shown a large population that experiences demographic stochasticity over time. It experiences ups and downs in its population. I've also shown the red line, which is the minimum viable population size. That is to say that population size is the least number of individuals that this population can have in order to be reproductively sustainable. As long as we have a large population size, then any demographically stochastic event will keep us above the MVP. A mistake that some conservation managers make is they identify that MVP and then they set the protected population to be just above that size. Unfortunately, that means that any demographic stochasticity immediately drops you below the MVP and leads to local extinction. A second factor is the Ali effect. Many populations have a minimum viable population size for ecological reasons, but they also have a minimum viable density that's necessary for normal reproductive behavior. The population on the right might be well above the MVP ecologically, but they're below the minimum viable density necessary for normal reproductive behavior. This would be the Ali effect. An example would be the passenger pigeon. There were billions of passenger pigeons in the 1800s, and they were blatantly overexploited. We decided to stop exploiting them when there were 30,000 individuals left, which should be sufficient for a minimum viable population. However, due to the Ali effect, the population density of the remaining individuals was not high enough to elicit reproductive behavior, and the 30,000 remaining individuals simply stopped reproducing. And our third source of vulnerability can be what I broadly call edge effects. And this can include an array of things like genetic factors, like genetic swamping and outbreeding depression, and traditional edge effects like increased access via predators or invasive species. In essence, for a given population size, that minimum viable population should exist within a core portion of the habitat, such that edge effects can penetrate into the edge, but they're not going to degrade the minimum viable population. However, if our population size shrinks to be the size of that MVP, then all of those edge effects are constant, and so all of our habitat is completely degraded. and our population size is now at risk due to a suite of edge effects. Our third question asks us to use the Mingo National Wildlife Refuge as an example of how to apply the island biogeography model. As we come off the Ozark Plateau in southeast Missouri, we encounter a vast swath of what was traditionally Missouri River bottomland hardwood forest. Almost all of those trees have been cut down, and now instead of hardwood river bottom forest, you have a sea of agriculture, of mostly cotton. The Mingo National Wildlife Refuge is a tiny little island of river bottom hardwood forest in a sea of industrial agriculture. And so to use the island biogeography model to predict how many species should be supported by Mingo, we need to know two things: its size and its distance to other source habitats. Its size is small. When you're driving up to it, you feel like you're driving up to a small square of forest in the middle of an ocean of agriculture. But we would predict the number of species present just using the size-area relationship. So depending if we're talking about predators or primary producers or what, each group of species has their own size-area relationship, which tells us how many we would expect to find in a piece of habitat like Mingo. And the other factor would be distance to other source populations. And the closest source river bottom hardwood forests, one is in Carbondale, Illinois, and the other one is on the Arkansas-Tennessee border near Memphis. So we don't have all of the information we need to do the actual math, but just observationally, this is a small island and it is really far away from other habitats, so we would expect it to have very few species. And question 4 asks us why the census population size is not always a good indicator of population viability. And there are two primary reasons, one being age skew and the other being sex ratio skew. Most wild populations have an inverse pyramid structure to their age distribution. That is to say, you have the most young individuals, the next most amount of middle-aged reproductive individuals, and the fewest old individuals. That distribution by itself means that your census population size is going to include more young individuals which don't have reproductive potential in the immediate future. With respect to sex ratio skew, many wild populations actually have more females than they have males, and that's because males fight with each other, compete for access to females, and die younger. And so in general, your effective population size can be a little bit larger due to your sex ratio skew, because the number of reproductive individuals that you have, specifically reproductive females, tells you your effective population size. And question 5 asks you to describe how North American bison might actually be a zombie species. Zombie species can arise for a number of reasons, but the primary situation behind a zombie species is that if you look at the current census population, the number of reproductively active individuals, or the effective population, cannot have a reproductive output that takes the population above its MVP. And so bison are native to North American tallgrass prairie, which used to occupy most of central North America. Here I have a picture of Kansas, which, depending on the estimates, was anywhere between 80 and 90% tallgrass prairie historically. Now, the only tallgrass prairie are those 4 red dots that I have left. So there's 1% left. Of the rest, most is industrial agriculture, like corn and wheat and soybeans, and that is not suitable habitat for bison, and there's fencing and highways that prevents them from accessing it in any case.